Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're tackling, well, just a massive period of change in American history. We're looking at 1890 through 1945.
Yeah, it's an incredible 55 years.
Yeah.
You start with the U.S. really focused inwards, a regional power.
Right. Frederick Jackson Turner is talking about the frontier closing, very much an internal focus.
Exactly. Rural, mostly agrarian, kind of isolated culturally. And then, boom, by 1945, you have the dominant global superpower. It's just a staggering transformation.
It really is. So our mission today, essentially, is to unpack how that happened. We'll be tracing the big threads using the source material, the pull towards imperialism, the whole progressive push for efficiency.
The massive cultural shifts in the 20s, the absolute trauma of the Great Depression and the New Deal trying to fix it, and of course the two world wars that just reshaped everything.
So the core question, looking at all this, is how did American identity, what the sources call NAT, and its place in the World War change so dramatically so fast? How did this nation, founded on ideas of self-rule, become, well, an empire and then a superpower?
That's the central puzzle we need to piece together. It's about reconciling those founding ideals with this completely new global role.
Okay, let's kick things off right around the turn of the century, this imperial moment. It seems like suddenly the U.S. wakes up and realizes its factories are churning out way too much stuff for just Americans to buy.
And that realization sparks this huge debate we see in the sources. Should America become an empire? Should it grab colonies?
It seems almost unavoidable, though, economically speaking.
Well, the pressure was immense. I mean, think about the post-Civil War industrial boom. You had factories and farms just producing more and more than the home market could possibly absorb. Prices for crops were low. Factories faced gluts.
So expansion wasn't just like ambition. It was almost a necessity to find new markets, new places to sell all this stuff and get raw materials too, presumably.
Precisely. That's the economic imperative argument. And, while we often pinpoint the Spanish-American War as the start, the idea wasn't totally alien. Remember Alaska back in 1867?
Oh, yeah. Seward's Folly. Everyone thought it was a useless icebox.
Right. Until they found gold and realized its strategic value. Suddenly, buying or taking faraway lands didn't seem so foolish. It kind of paved the way mentally.
And it wasn't always the government planting the flag first, was it? Sometimes it was big business just moving in.
Absolutely critical point. We see this rise of what you might call economic imperialism. The classic example is Minor Keith.
The banana guy. United Fruit Company.
That's the one. He didn't just trade bananas in Costa Rica and Central America. He built railways, controlled huge amounts of land, influenced politics. He basically created a banana empire. It showed you could dominate economically without the hassle of direct political rule.
Power without the paperwork, kind of. But they still needed to sell this idea back home, right? It couldn't just be about profit.
No, definitely not. And that's where the ideological justifications become so important in the sources. You see a lot of racial theories being brought in.
Like social Darwinism, the whole survival of the fittest applied to nations.
Exactly. And figures like Josiah Strong, in his book Our Country, really pushed this idea of Anglo-Saxon superiority. He argued it was America's destiny, even a divine duty, to, uplift and Christianize these supposedly weaker peoples around the world.
So you wrap the economic self-interest in this cloak of moral obligation. The white man's burden, as Senator Albert Beveridge famously put it. It sounds noble, almost.
It was incredibly powerful rhetoric. And it dovetailed perfectly with new strategic thinking, especially about the Navy.
Mahan. Alfred Thayer Mahan.
Yes. His book, The Influence of Sea Power Upon History from 1890, was a bombshell. He argued very persuasively that history showed great nations needed great navies, modern steel fleets. And those fleets needed overseas bases, coaling stations, repair docks.
Which creates an immediate argument for taking places like Hawaii, Guam, the Philippines.
Precisely. Congress bought into it. They funded the Great White Fleet. And suddenly, having those strategic islands wasn't just nice. It was necessary to project power. The Navy became the engine driving that imperial ambition.
But not everyone was on board. There was serious pushback, right? The anti-imperialists.
Oh, absolutely. A very strong opposition grounded in core American values, self-determination, democracy. They asked, how can a republic dedicated to liberty justify ruling other people against their will?
Mark Twain was a big voice there, wasn't he? Pointing out the hypocrisy.
He was savage about it. He saw it as betraying American ideals, basically swapping Spanish tyranny for American tyranny. No. And the Anti-Imperialist League was this fascinating coalition.
Yeah, who was in it?
All sorts. Labor leaders worried about competition from cheap colonial labor, social reformers, politicians. And surprisingly, some major industrialists like Andrew Carnegie.
Carnegie, why him?
He thought imperialism was morally wrong and bad for business long term. He actually offered the government $20 million, the price they paid Spain for the Philippines, if they'd just grant the islands independence.
Wow. That's putting your money where your mouth is. They also raised tricky legal questions, didn't they?
Huge ones. The big one was, does the Constitution follow the flag? Meaning, if the U.S. annexes these places, do the people there automatically get full constitutional rights?
Which the imperialists definitely did not want, especially concerning non-white populations.
Exactly. They worried about incorporating millions of people they considered racially inferior into the body politic, so they preferred ambiguity. And we can't forget the resistance from the colonized people.
Like Queen Liliuokalani in Hawaii.
Her overthrow became a powerful symbol for the anti-imperialists. And thinkers like W.E.B. Du Bois immediately drew the connection, saying imperialism abroad was just another form of the racism and oppression Black Americans faced at home. It was all part of the same system of white supremacy.
So this fierce debate is raging. And then, 1898, the Spanish-American War kind of forces the issue.
It really does. It's a culmination of these underlying economic and strategic desires, but it needed a spark, and the media provided it.
Ah, yellow journalism. Hearst and Pulitzer battling it out.
They were masters of sensationalism. They played up Spanish atrocities in Cuba, some real, some exaggerated, some maybe even invented, whipping up public fury and demand for intervention. The U.S. already had eyes on Cuba for strategic reasons, but this gave it a moral gloss.
And then the USS Maine explodes in Havana Harbor.
February 1898. We still don't know for sure what happened, probably an internal accident, but the yellow press instantly screamed, "Spanish treachery." The slogan, "Remember the Maine, to hell with Spain," swept the nation. President McKinley, whatever his private doubts, basically had no political choice but to declare war.
And the war itself was quick.
Very quick. Only lasted a few months. A splendid little war, as one official called it. But the consequences were enormous. The Treaty of Paris in 1898 officially made the U.S. a colonial power.
Right. Spain ceded Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines.
Yes, the Philippines were sold for $20 million.
And it's interesting how their paths diverged. Puerto Ricans eventually got U.S. citizenship under the Jones Act in 1917, after initial governance under the Four-Acre Act. Guam remained more of a strategic outpost. In Cuba, it got independence, sort of.
Sort of is the right word. The U.S. imposed the Platt Amendment on the new Cuban Constitution. This basically gave the U.S. the right to intervene militarily whenever it felt its interests were threatened. So independence with major strings attached. An empire-like, you could say.
Which didn't sit well with everyone, especially not in the Philippines.
No. Filipino nationalists, led by Emilio Aguinaldo, had been fighting Spain for independence. They thought the U.S. was liberating them. When they realized they'd just traded one colonial master for another, they fought back.
The Philippine-American War.
Exactly, from 1899 to 1902. It was a brutal, bloody conflict. The U.S. used harsh counterinsurgency tactics. It really exposed the ugly reality behind the civilizing mission idea. Many thousands died.
And while that was happening, the U.S. was also making moves in Asia, specifically China, the open door policy.
Right, so Secretary of State John Hay sent notes to the major European powers who were carving up China into exclusive spheres of influence. Hay basically demanded that everyone maintain an open door for trade, meaning give American businesses equal access to Chinese markets.
So not about grabbing territory there, but about ensuring economic access, protecting American commercial interests.
Precisely. It signaled the U.S. was now a major player in Asian geopolitics, willing to use diplomacy backed by that new Navy to assert its economic rights. So by the early 1900s, the U.S. has interests and influence spanning the globe.
And all this power, this industrial might that fueled imperialism was also causing massive problems back home, right? The Gilded Age issues. Which leads us to the progressives.
Exactly. Progressivism emerges as this broad, multifaceted response to the excesses of the Gilded Age. The huge corporations, the monopolies, the political corruption, the urban poverty, the unsafe working conditions, Jim Crow segregation, all of it.
What tied them together? It seems like a diverse movement.
The core belief was that government could and should be used as a tool to fix these problems. They believed in expertise, in science, in efficiency. They wanted to make society more orderly, more rational, and for many, more moral and just.
And one of their main weapons was just telling the truth, exposing the problems.
Yes. Muckraking journalism was absolutely central. These weren't just opinion writers. They were investigative reporters digging up facts to shock the public into demanding change.
Like Upton Sinclair in The Jungle.
A perfect example. He meant it as socialist propaganda, but the public reaction was revulsion at the disgusting conditions in the meatpacking plants he described. That directly led to the Pure Food and Drug Act and the Meat Inspection Act in 1906. Real, tangible change.
Or Ida Tarbell taking on Standard Oil.
Her meticulous expose of Rockefeller's ruthless tactics fueled the antitrust movement. You had photographers like Jacob Riis with How the Other Half Lives, using images to show the shocking poverty in New York's tenements. It forced people to see what they preferred to ignore.
And it wasn't just white reformers, right? You mentioned Eng Poon Shu earlier.
Yes, figures like him used the language of progressivism, fairness, justice, rights, to advocate for marginalized groups like Chinese immigrants, who were facing intense discrimination and exclusion.
The progressives also wanted to clean up politics itself, make it more democratic, more responsive to the people instead of party bosses.
Definitely. They pushed for things like the secret ballot to prevent voter intimidation. The 17th Amendment was huge, requiring direct election of senators by the people instead of by state legislatures controlled by party machines. And locally, you had innovations like the Wisconsin idea under Robert La Follette, using university experts to draft legislation.
And then there were the huge constitutional changes, the 16th Amendment, the income tax. That seems fundamental.
It was arguably the most transformative piece of progressive legislation.
Yeah.
Before that, the federal government mostly ran on tariffs, which are unstable and hit poorer people harder.
Right.
The income tax gave the federal government a massive, stable, and potentially progressive source of revenue, meaning higher rates for higher incomes. It's what made the New Deal possible, funded World War II, built the modern federal state. Without the 16th Amendment, the U.S. government looks completely different.
Alongside that, you get the 19th Amendment. Women finally get the vote nationwide after decades of struggle. And the 18th Amendment, prohibition.
Yeah, prohibition,
Oh.
driven by temperance movements, often linked to Protestant morality, aiming to cure social ills by banning alcohol. A classic progressive moral reform effort, though obviously controversial and ultimately repealed.
One last progressive area we should touch on is the environment, because they applied that same idea of expert management, but it led to a split.
A really important split. You had the preservationists versus the conservationists.
John Muir on one side.
Right. Muir, the founder of the Sierra Club, was a preservationist. He believed wild nature had intrinsic spiritual value and should be protected from human interference. Set aside pristine wilderness areas like Yosemite National Park. Keep people out as much as possible.
And the other side, Gifford Pinchot.
Pinchot, who became the first head of the U.S. Forest Service under Teddy Roosevelt, was the leading conservationist. He believed in the wise use of natural resources. The goal wasn't to lock nature away, but to manage it scientifically. Logging, mining, grazing sustainably, efficiently for the long-term economic benefit of humans.
So both using science and expertise, but with totally different goals for nature. One focused on intrinsic value, the other on resource management.
Exactly. It shows the different ways that core progressive belief in efficiency could be applied.
Okay, so this progressive focus on planning, efficiency, centralized control, it gets put to the ultimate test with World War I. But the U.S. really tried to stay out of it initially, didn't it?
Desperately. The tradition of avoiding entangling European alliances, going back to Washington, was deeply ingrained. President Wilson won re-election in 1916, partly on the slogan, "He kept us out of war."
So what dragged the U.S. in?
A few key things made neutrality impossible. First, economics. American banks had loaned enormous sums to Britain and France. If they lost, those loans might never be repaid. American industry was also supplying the Allies.
So the U.S. economy was already tied to an Allied victory.
Pretty much. Then there was Germany's strategy of unrestricted submarine warfare. Their U-boats started sinking all ships heading to Britain, including passenger liners.
Like the Lusitania.
The sinking of the Lusitania in 1915 killed over 1,200 people, including 128 Americans. That caused huge public outrage here. Germany backed off for a while, but then they resumed it, gambling they could starve Britain before the U.S. could mobilize.
And the final straw.
The Zimmermann Telegram, early 1917. This was a secret, coded message from Germany to Mexico, proposing an alliance. Germany promised Mexico financial aid and help reclaiming lost territory, Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, if Mexico attacked the U.S.
Wow. Okay, that brings the threat right to the border.
Exactly. The British intercepted it, decoded it, and leaked it to the U.S. press. Public opinion went ballistic. That, combined with the ongoing submarine attacks, gave Wilson the justification he needed. He went to Congress in April 1917, framing it not as a war for territory or gain, but as a moral crusade to make the world safe for democracy.
And the American troops, the AEF, under General Pershing, they made a real difference, even though they arrived late.
Absolutely decisive. The war had been a bloody stalemate in the trenches for years. The arrival of millions of fresh American soldiers tipped the balance.
Where did they have the biggest impact?
The Meuse-Argonne offensive in late 1918 was a major contribution, helping break the German lines. And we should definitely highlight the role of segregated African-American units. The Harlem Hellfighters, for instance, were attached to the French army and served with incredible bravery and distinction, facing intense combat. And you had individual heroes emerge, like Sergeant Alvin C. York.
Back home, the war effort required, well, basically the government taking over the economy, right? Peak progressivism in action.
Unprecedented federal control. The War Industries Board, WIB, led by Bernard Baruch, essentially told factories what to produce, how much, and allocated raw materials. It was centralized economic planning on a scale never seen before.
And managing food, too.
Yep, the Food Administration, under future President Herbert Hoover, didn't use rationing mandates much, but relied on voluntary efforts. Food will win the war. Promoting meatless Mondays, wheatless Wednesdays, victory gardens, using propaganda and appeals to patriotism to conserve resources. It was incredibly effective mobilization.
But all this unity and control came at a cost to freedom of speech.
A huge cost. The government cracked down hard on dissent. You had the Espionage Act of 1917 and the Sedition Act of 1918. These laws made it a crime to interfere with the draft, obstruct war bond sales, or even just say or write anything disloyal, profane, scurrilous, or abusive about the government, the flag, or the military.
That sounds incredibly broad.
It was. Thousands were prosecuted. The key Supreme Court case was Schenck v. United States in 1919. Schenck was a socialist distributing anti-draft leaflets. The court upheld his conviction, creating the famous clear and present danger test.
Meaning speech isn't protected if it creates a danger, like falsely shouting fire in a theater.
Exactly. Justice Holmes argued that wartime allows greater restrictions on speech than peacetime. This precedent was used to jail many anti-war activists, socialists, and labor leaders, like Eugene Debs and Emma Goldman, who was eventually deported. Civil liberties took a major hit.
And this fear and suppression didn't just end when the war did, right? It morphed into something else.
It led right into the first Red Scare, from 1919 to 1920. The Bolshevik Revolution in Russia in 1917 terrified many Americans. Combine that fear of communism with post-war labor strikes and a few anarchist bombings, and you got widespread panic about a potential revolution here.
Led by Attorney General Palmer.
A. Mitchell Palmer really fanned the flames. He launched the Palmer Raids, rounding up thousands of suspected radicals, immigrants, socialists, anarchists, often without warrants, holding them in jail, deporting hundreds. It was a period of intense xenophobia and violation of civil rights, often assisted by volunteer groups like the American Protective League, spying on their neighbors.
And this anti-radical, anti-immigrant feeling fed into actual laws restricting immigration.
Directly. The war had already slowed immigration, but the Red Scare and a general rise in nativism led to demands for permanent restrictions. You get the Emergency Quota Act in 1921, which set temporary quotas based on nationality.
And then the big one in 1924.
The National Origins Act in 1924. This made the quotas much stricter and permanent. Crucially, it based the quotas on the 1890 census.
Why 1890?
Because before 1890, most immigrants came from Northern and Western Europe, Britain, Germany, Scandinavia. After 1890, more came from Southern and Eastern Europe, Italy, Poland, Russia, Jews. By using the 1890 baseline, the law deliberately favored the older immigrant groups and drastically cut numbers from the newer ones. It also completely banned immigration from most of Asia. It was explicitly designed to preserve a certain racial and ethnic makeup of the country.
While all this is happening internationally and politically, there's a huge demographic shift within the U.S., too. The Great Migration.
Yes, one of the most significant internal movements in American history. Starting around 1910 and accelerating during the war, hundreds of thousands of African Americans began leaving the rural South.
What was pushing them out?
Jim Crow, segregation, obviously. The constant threat of violence, lynching, lack of basic rights. And economically, the sharecropping system often kept families trapped in debt and poverty. Boll weevil infestations also ruined cotton crops, wiping out livelihoods.
And what was pulling them north and west?
Jobs, especially wartime industrial jobs in cities like Chicago, Detroit, New York, Philadelphia. With European immigration cut off by the war and later the Quota Acts, northern factories desperately needed labor. Plus, the promise of maybe a little more freedom, better schools, the right to vote.
And they had networks helping them.
Absolutely. Black newspapers like the Chicago Defender were hugely influential, actively encouraging migration, publishing stories of success in the North, even running train schedules. And once communities formed, people helped family and friends make the journey. Organizations like Ada S. McKinley's Settlement House in Chicago provided vital support finding housing, jobs, navigating city life.
But moving north didn't mean escaping racism entirely.
Not at all. As black populations grew in northern cities, competition for jobs and housing increased, leading to racial tensions and violence. The summer of 1919 saw horrific race riots in dozens of cities, earning it the name Red Summer. And then you have atrocities like the 1921 Tulsa Massacre, where a prosperous black neighborhood, Greenwood, was literally burned to the ground by a white mob. Migration opened opportunities, but profound racial hostility remained.
Okay, so we have migration, post-war anxiety, new technologies. This all sets the stage for the Roaring '20s, a decade of massive economic boom, but also intense cultural conflict.
Absolutely. The economic engine of the 20s was mass production, perfected by Henry Ford.
Fordism and the assembly line.
Exactly. By breaking down car manufacturing into simple, repetitive tasks done by workers as the chassis moved past them, Ford slashed production time and costs. The Model T became affordable for millions.
Which changed everything.
Completely reshaped American life. Led to suburbs, highways, gas stations, motels, a whole car-based culture. It also changed work itself. The underlying philosophy was Frederick W. Taylor's scientific management, or Taylorism.
Breaking down every movement to make it faster.
Yes, timing workers with stopwatches, analyzing every motion to eliminate wasted effort and maximize output.
Efficiency above all. It boosted productivity enormously, but also made factory work incredibly monotonous and often dehumanizing.
And all this efficient production created stuff. Lots of stuff to buy. A consumer culture.
Driven by new mass media. Radio became huge in the 20s. National networks like NBC started broadcasting the same programs across the country, creating a shared popular culture. Cinema exploded, too, especially after 1927 with The Jazz Singer, the first major talkie. Stars like Rudolph Valentino became national icons.
And advertising figures out how to sell all this stuff. Oh, yeah. Advertising becomes a major industry, moving beyond just announcing products to using psychological techniques playing on people's insecurities, desires for status, associating products with glamour or success, often influenced by Freudian ideas floating around. Consumption became central to the American dream.
And cities are booming. 1920 was the first time more Americans lived in cities than in rural areas.
A major demographic milestone. Urban life fostered new social possibilities. You see the emergence of the flapper young women challenging traditional norms with shorter hair, shorter skirts, smoking, drinking, a new sense of independence. Figures like cosmetics entrepreneur Elizabeth Ann Graham built empires catering to this modern woman. And immigrants, despite the restrictions, continued to shape city life, like Hector Boiardi, Chef Boyardee, starting his business.
But this rapid change, this modern urban culture, clashed hard with traditional, rural, often religious values.
That clash is the defining tension of the decade. You see it most famously in the Scopes trial of 1925, the Monkey Trial.
Over teaching evolution in Tennessee.
Right. Pitting celebrity lawyer Clarence Darrow, defending the teacher John Scopes and representing modern science, against William Jennings Bryan, the three-time presidential candidate and champion of Protestant fundamentalism.
It became a media circus.
Totally.
Yeah.
While Scopes was technically found guilty and fined $100, the trial was widely seen in the national press as a victory for modernism, making Bryan and the fundamentalists look outdated and anti-intellectual. It symbolized this deep cultural divide between urban modernity and rural traditionalism.
At the same time, you have this incredible explosion of Black artistic expression, the Harlem Renaissance.
A true cultural flowering centered in Harlem, New York. Writers like Langston Hughes and Zora Neale Hurston, musicians like Louis Armstrong and Duke Ellington, artists, all exploring Black identity, celebrating Black culture, pushing back against racism through art. It was about defining a new Negro, proud, assertive, culturally independent.
And then you had another group of writers, the Lost Generation.
Yeah, mostly white writers, many of whom had experienced World War I, like F. Scott Fitzgerald, Ernest Hemingway, Gertrude Stein. They were deeply disillusioned by the war's brutality and what they saw as the shallow materialism and conformity of American culture in the 20s. They often lived as expatriates in Paris, critiquing America from afar.
So lots of cultural energy, but the darker side of nativism and racism didn't go away.
Far from it. It became more institutionalized in some ways. The Supreme Court made key rulings reinforcing racial barriers. In Ozawa v. United States, 1922, and United States v. Thind, 1923, the court denied citizenship to Japanese and Indian immigrants, respectively, arguing they weren't white persons under the law, even if scientifically they might be Caucasian. It codified racial exclusion at the highest level.
And the Sacco and Vanzetti case.
A huge international controversy. Two Italian immigrants, self-proclaimed anarchists, were convicted and eventually executed for robbery and murder in Massachusetts, on what many saw as flimsy evidence. The trial seemed heavily influenced by prejudice against their ethnicity and political beliefs, highlighting the intense xenophobia of the era. And perhaps most chillingly, the embrace of eugenics, a pseudoscience of racial purity. The Supreme Court actually endorsed it in Buck v. Bell, 1927.
What did that case do?
It upheld the state of Virginia's right to forcibly sterilize people deemed unfit, like Gary Buck, who was institutionalized. Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. infamously wrote, "3 generations of imbeciles are enough." It showed how progressive ideas about scientific management could be twisted into horrifying social control based on flawed, racist science.
Okay, so the Roaring Twenties, this decade of boom and conflict, ends with an epic crash. The Great Depression. Was it just the stock market crash?
The crash in October 1929, Black Tuesday, was the trigger, the dramatic event. But the Depression had deeper roots. The prosperity of the 20s was built on shaky foundations.
What were the main weaknesses?
Several big ones the sources point to. First, agriculture never really recovered after WWI. Farmers faced falling prices and mounting debt throughout the 20s, leading to widespread foreclosures even before the crash.
And globally?
Protectionism was a killer. The Smoot-Hawley tariff in 1930 raised U.S. import duties to record highs. Other countries retaliated with their own tariffs. Global trade just seized up, making everything worse.
But internally, the wealth wasn't evenly spread.
Not even close. Wealth concentration was extreme. The top sliver got much richer, while workers' wages stagnated. This meant the economy relied heavily on the wealthy investing and spending, and on ordinary people buying things, cars, radios, stocks on credit, often installment plans. It was unsustainable. Too much speculation, not enough real purchasing power underneath.
So when the stock market crashed,
it wasn't just stock values wiped out. It shattered confidence. People stopped spending. Businesses stopped investing, laid off workers. Banks started failing because people rushed to withdraw savings, and banks had made bad loans or invested depositors' money in the crashing stock market. It created a vicious downward spiral.
And unemployment just soared.
To catastrophic levels. By 1933, roughly 25% of the workforce was unemployed, maybe 1 in 4 people. Industrial production collapsed. People lost homes, farms. Desperation was everywhere.
How did President Hoover respond initially?
Hoover believed strongly in rugged individualism and voluntary cooperation. He urged business leaders not to cut wages, encouraged private charities. He thought direct federal relief would undermine American character.
Did he do anything federally?
Reluctantly, yes. He eventually created the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, RFC, in 1932, to lend money to banks, railroads, and other big institutions, hoping it would trickle down. But it was seen as too little, too late, and helping corporations while people starved.
Which is why people started calling shantytowns Hoovervilles.
Exactly. Public perception turned sharply against him. He seemed uncaring, ineffective. The 1932 election was a landslide for Franklin D. Roosevelt, who promised Americans a New Deal.
And the New Deal signaled a fundamental shift in the role of government.
Absolutely massive. FDR embraced the idea that the federal government had a direct responsibility to provide for the welfare of its citizens, to actively intervene in the economy to fight the Depression. This redefined American liberalism for decades.
He structured it around the 3 R's, right?
Relief, recovery, and reform. That was the framework.
So relief was about immediate help.
Yes, getting money and jobs to people quickly. Programs like the Public Works Administration, PWA, funded massive infrastructure projects, bridges, dams, schools creating jobs. The Civilian Conservation Corps, CCC, put hundreds of thousands of young unemployed men to work on conservation projects in national parks and forests.
And the TVA, Tennessee Valley Authority.
That was huge and ambitious. It aimed to modernize the entire impoverished Tennessee Valley region by building dams for flood control and hydroelectric power, bringing electricity, jobs, and improved farming techniques. It showed the government could transform a whole region. Recovery aimed at getting the economy going again, often through cooperation between government and industry, though some of those efforts were less successful or ruled unconstitutional. But the lasting impact came from reform.
Preventing another crash.
Exactly. Creating safeguards. The Glass-Steagall Act was key. It separated commercial banking, everyday deposits, from risky investment banking. And crucially, it created the FDIC, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation,
Guaranteeing bank deposits.
up to a certain amount. That single move restored public faith in the banking system. People stopped hoarding cash. You also get the Securities and Exchange Commission, SEC, to regulate the stock market, prevent fraud, and curb the kind of wild speculation that led to the crash.
And the biggest reform of all, maybe, Social Security.
The Social Security Act of 1935 is monumental. It established a permanent federal system of old age pensions, retirement benefits, unemployment insurance, and financial aid for dependent children and people with disabilities. It created a fundamental safety net, acknowledging that industrial society created risks individuals couldn't always handle alone.
But the New Deal wasn't universally popular. There was pushback.
Oh, definitely. From both sides. On the left, critics like Senator Huey Long of Louisiana, with his Share Our Wealth plan, argued FDR wasn't going far enough, wasn't redistributing wealth radically enough. Labor unions, especially the new Congress of Industrial Organizations, CIO, also pushed for more worker protections.
And from the right, conservatives and business leaders.
They hated it, called it socialism, creeping dictatorship, federal overreach. They challenged many New Deal programs in court. The Supreme Court initially struck down several key pieces of legislation, like the National Industrial Recovery Act, an IRA, in the Schechter Poultry case, ruling Congress had delegated too much power.
Which led to FDR's court packing plan.
His attempt in 1937 to add more justices to the Supreme Court, ostensibly to help with the workload, but really to get judges more sympathetic to the New Deal. It backfired, politically seen as an attack on judicial independence, even by some supporters. But interestingly, the court started upholding more New Deal laws shortly after, sometimes called the switch in time that saved nine.
Politically, though, the New Deal created a powerful new coalition for the Democrats.
Absolutely. It forged this broad coalition that dominated American politics for decades. Traditional Southern Democrats, urban ethnic voters like Italians, Poles, Jews, represented by figures like Fiorello LaGuardia in NYC or Dionisio Chavez in New Mexico, industrial workers and unions, farmers, and critically African Americans.
African Americans started shifting from the party of Lincoln to the Democrats.
Yes. While FDR didn't push hard on civil rights legislation for fear of alienating Southern Democrats, New Deal relief programs did help many black families survive. And figures like Mary McLeod Bethune, an influential black educator, held positions in the administration, part of the informal black cabinet, giving African Americans a sense of inclusion and hope.
Did the New Deal actually end the Depression, though?
That's debatable. It definitely alleviated suffering, restored confidence, and built lasting infrastructure and safety nets. But mass unemployment persisted throughout the 1930s. What really ended the Depression was the massive government spending required for World War II.
Which brings us to the next global conflict. After WWI, the U.S. tried hard to stay isolationist, didn't it?
Very much so. Harding won in 1920, promising a return to normalcy. The Senate rejected the Treaty of Versailles and U.S. membership in the League of Nations. The dominant mood through the 20s and 30s was disillusionment with foreign wars and a desire to focus inward.
But the U.S. wasn't totally disengaged.
No, it engaged economically, trying to promote stability through finance, like the Dawes Plan to help Germany manage war reparations, and diplomatically through things like the Kellogg-Briand Pact of 1928, where dozens of nations renounced war. But it had no enforcement mechanism, purely symbolic.
Then in the 1930s, you get the rise of aggressive dictatorships, Nazi Germany, fascist Italy, Imperial Japan. How did the U.S. react?
With deep unease, but also deep division. The isolationists were powerful. They pointed to the Nye Committee hearings, which suggested arms manufacturers, merchants of death, had pushed the U.S. into WWI for profit. They passed neutrality acts designed to automatically keep the U.S. out of future wars.
But others saw the threat. Interventionists.
Yes, they argued that fascism and militarism posed an existential threat to democracy everywhere, including the U.S. eventually. They believed Britain and France were the front lines of defense and needed American help. President Roosevelt clearly sided with the interventionists, but had to move cautiously because public opinion was so strongly isolationist initially.
So he took steps gradually.
Very gradually pushing the boundaries of neutrality. First, in 1939, came cash and carry, allowing warring nations, really Britain and France, to buy U.S. arms if they paid cash and transported them on their own ships.
Then the Destroyers for Bases deal.
In 1940, he traded 50 aging WWI destroyers to Britain, desperate after the fall of France, in exchange for long-term leases on British naval bases in the Atlantic. A clever way to help Britain, without directly violating neutrality laws.
And the big one, Lend-Lease.
Lend-Lease in early 1941 was a game changer. FDR used the analogy of lending a neighbor a garden hose if their house is on fire. It allowed the U.S. to lend or lease arms and supplies to any country whose defense was deemed vital to U.S. security, primarily Britain, and later the Soviet Union after Hitler invaded them. The U.S. became the arsenal of democracy, effectively bankrolling the Allied war effort.
But the U.S. still wasn't in the war. What changed that?
December 7, 1941, the surprise attack by Japan on the U.S. Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii.
That unified the country overnight.
Instantly, isolationism evaporated. The attack galvanized the nation and led to an immediate declaration of war against Japan, and shortly after, Germany and Italy declared war on the U.S. America was fully committed to World War II.
And the mobilization for this war was even bigger than WWI.
On a scale almost unimaginable, the War Production Board, WPB, took charge, orchestrating the conversion of nearly all civilian industry to war production. Car factories made tanks and planes. Typewriter companies made machine guns.
Your industrial output was just staggering.
It truly was. Places like Ford's Willow Run factory churning out a B-24 bomber almost every hour. Boeing producing thousands of B-17s and B-29s. Massive shipyards like Marin shipbuilding vessels at incredible speed. This overwhelming industrial power was maybe the single most decisive factor in winning the war. It literally buried the Axis under mountains of equipment.
And like WWI, this mobilization changed society back home. Women's roles
Dramatically expanded. Millions of women entered the workforce, especially in defense industries, taking jobs previously held by men. Rosie the Riveter became the iconic symbol. While many women left these jobs after the war, it challenged traditional gender roles and planted seeds for the future feminist movement. You even saw things like the All-American Girls Professional Baseball League, created to fill the gap left by male players serving overseas.
What about African Americans? You mentioned the Double V campaign.
Yes, fighting for victory against fascism abroad and victory against racism at home. The war created leverage. A. Philip Randolph, head of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, threatened a massive march on Washington in 1941 to protest discrimination in defense jobs.
And FDR responded.
He couldn't afford that kind of disruption during mobilization. He issued Executive Order 8802, banning racial discrimination in defense industries and government work, and creating the Fair Employment Practices Committee, FEPC, to investigate complaints. It was a landmark step, though limited in enforcement.
And black soldiers served despite segregation.
Yes, in segregated units, often facing discrimination. But their contributions were vital. The Tuskegee Airmen, the fighter pilots who escorted bombers over Europe with distinction. Highly decorated infantry units like the All-Nisei 442nd Regimental Combat Team, composed of Japanese Americans, many of whom had families in internment camps back home. Their bravery challenged racist assumptions.
What about Latino communities?
Mexican Americans also served in large numbers, and the Bracero program, started in 1942, brought hundreds of thousands of temporary Mexican laborers to the U.S. to work in agriculture, filling labor shortages. But this coexisted with ongoing prejudice, seen tragically in the Zoot Suit riots in L.A. in 1943, where white servicemen attacked young Mexican Americans wearing distinctive Zoot Suits.
But there was a huge violation of civil liberties during WWII as well, wasn't there? Targeting one specific group.
Yes, the internment of Japanese Americans. Following Pearl Harbor, fueled by war hysteria and decades of anti-Japanese racism on the West Coast, FDR issued Executive Order 9066 in February 1942.
What did it authorize?
It authorized the military to designate areas from which any or all persons may be excluded. It was used almost exclusively against Japanese American citizens and non-citizens alike on the West Coast. Over 110,000 people were forced from their homes, lost their property and businesses, and were incarcerated in remote internment camps for most of the war, despite no evidence of widespread disloyalty.
And the Supreme Court upheld this.
Tragically, yes. In the 1944 case Korematsu v. United States, the court ruled that the internment was justified by military necessity during wartime. It's now widely seen as a grave injustice and a failure of the legal system to protect constitutional rights based on race.
Okay, turning to the military victory itself, what was the overall Allied strategy?
Close cooperation between the U.S., Britain, and the Soviet Union was key, planned at conferences like Tehran. The general agreement was a Europe-first strategy to defeat Germany, the greater immediate threat, then focus on Japan.
So in Europe,
The U.S. and Britain opened the Western Front with the D-Day landings in Normandy, France, on June 6, 1944. A massive amphibious invasion that began the liberation of France and pushed towards Germany. The Soviets were simultaneously pushing from the east. Germany fought fiercely, launching a final counteroffensive in the Battle of the Bulge, but Allied power was overwhelming.
And in the Pacific.
The U.S. employed an island-hopping strategy. Led by Admiral Nimitz and General MacArthur, forces would capture strategically important islands, bypassing heavily fortified Japanese strongholds, getting progressively closer to Japan itself. Key battles included Midway, a turning point naval victory, Guadalcanal, Iwo Jima, Okinawa. Incredibly brutal fighting.
Technology played a big role, too.
Huge innovations. Charles Drew's pioneering work on blood plasma storage saved countless lives. The Norden bomb sight improved bombing accuracy, and of course the top-secret Manhattan Project.
The development of the atomic bomb.
Yes. Conducted in secret locations across the U.S., employing thousands of scientists and workers. When the first bomb was successfully tested in July 1945, President Truman, who had taken over after FDR's death, faced the decision of whether to use it against Japan.
A hugely controversial decision.
Immensely. Faced with intelligence predicting massive casualties, potentially up to 1 million Allied soldiers, and even more Japanese civilians in a conventional invasion of the Japanese home islands, Truman authorized the use of the bomb.
On Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
Hiroshima on August 6, 1945, and Nagasaki on August 9th. The devastation was unprecedented. Japan surrendered shortly after, formally ending World War II on September 2nd. The bombs undoubtedly hastened the war's end and arguably saved lives that would have been lost in an invasion, but they also ushered in the nuclear age and raised profound moral questions about warfare that we still grapple with today.
So the war ends, and the U.S. emerges. Well, not just as a major power, but as the superpower.
Unquestionably, Europe and Asia were devastated. The U.S. homeland was untouched by war. Its industrial base was stronger than ever. It had accumulated enormous wealth financing the war, and for a crucial few years, it had a monopoly on the atomic bomb. No other nation came close.
And unlike after WWI, this time the U.S. fully embraced a global leadership role. No return to isolationism.
The exact opposite. The U.S. took the lead in designing a whole new international system, aiming to prevent another world war and promote American interests, primarily democracy and capitalism.
Politically, the big step was the United Nations.
Yes, replacing the failed League of Nations. The UN Charter was signed in San Francisco in 1945. The U.S. was a driving force, ensuring it had a strong Security Council, where the U.S. held a permanent veto-wielding seat to enforce collective security, a commitment to international cooperation, but on terms favorable to U.S. power.
And economically. Bretton Woods seems key.
Bretton Woods, the conference held in New Hampshire in 1944, was absolutely fundamental to the post-war economic order. It established two major institutions, the International Monetary Fund, IMF, to stabilize exchange rates, and provide loans to countries with balance of payment problems.
And the World Bank.
Right, the World Bank, to provide loans for reconstruction and development projects. But the crucial part of Bretton Woods was making the U.S. dollar the anchor of the entire system.
How did that work?
Other currencies were pegged to the dollar, and the dollar itself was pegged to gold at a fixed rate, $35 an ounce. This created stable exchange rates, facilitating global trade and investment, but it also cemented the U.S. dollar and, by extension, the U.S. economy at the absolute center of the global financial system.
And there was also JT?
The General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, signed in 1947. This aimed to boost international commerce by encouraging member nations to reduce tariffs and other trade barriers. It underpinned the U.S. goal of creating an open, integrated global economy, one where American goods and capital could flow freely.
So the U.S. is building this new world order based on cooperation, democracy, free trade. But the wartime alliance with the Soviet Union falls apart almost immediately.
Very quickly. The seeds of conflict were there, even during the war, but became obvious at the Potsdam Conference in mid-1945. Deep disagreements emerged over the future of Eastern Europe. Stalin was installing communist-dominated governments in countries occupied by the Red Army, creating a buffer zone.
Which the West saw as Soviet expansionism.
Exactly. Winston Churchill famously warned in a 1946 speech that an iron curtain was descending across Europe, dividing the communist East from the democratic West. The Cold War had begun.
What was the U.S. strategy to deal with this?
Containment. The idea, most famously articulated by diplomat George Kennan, was that the U.S. couldn't roll back communism where it already existed without starting WWII, but it could and should work to contain its further spread, restrict Soviet influence using political, economic, and, if necessary, military pressure.
How did they implement containment?
On multiple fronts. Economically, the big one was the Marshall Plan, starting in 1948.
Billions in aid to Europe.
About $13 billion. A massive sum then offered to help rebuild war-torn Western European economies. was partly humanitarian, but also deeply strategic. The thinking was that prosperous, stable democracies would be less susceptible to communist takeovers. It was incredibly successful in reviving Western Europe and tying it closely to the U.S.
And militarily.
The formation of NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, in 1949. This was a formal military alliance, primarily between the U.S., Canada, and Western European nations. Its core principle was collective defense. An attack on one member was considered an attack on all.
Which was a radical break from traditional U.S. policy of avoiding permanent alliances.
A complete reversal. NATO signaled a long-term American military commitment to defending Western Europe against potential Soviet aggression. It solidified the military lines of the Cold War. #tag outro. So looking back over this whole period, 1890 to 1945, the transformation is just breathtaking. You start with a nation largely defined by its continental boundaries, wrestling with its own internal development.
And you end with the U.S. as the dominant global power, actively shaping international politics, economics, and military strategy. Isolationism is completely gone, replaced by deep global engagement. It's hard to overstate the scale of that shift.
It really is. But as we saw throughout the sources, there's this persistent, often painful paradox running through it all. The U.S. championed democracy and self-determination abroad, fighting 2 world wars, supposedly, for those ideals.
While simultaneously struggling, and often failing, to live up to those same ideals at home for its own citizens, for African Americans fighting Jim Crow, for immigrants facing nativism, for women seeking equal rights, for Japanese Americans interned during the war. That double V idea, victory at home and abroad, was a constant battle.
That tension, that gap between America's global projection of its ideals and the domestic reality is maybe the central legacy of this era, and it shapes everything that follows. Remember how we started this deep dive back with that 1890s debate? Imperialists arguing for uplift versus anti-imperialists demanding self-determination?
Yeah.
Well, we end in 1945 with the U.S. positioned as the global defender of freedom against communism, setting the stage for the Cold War.
Which leaves us with a really interesting question for you, the listener, to think about. Considering everything we've unpacked, did the U.S. successfully uphold that principle of national self-determination around the world after 1945? Or did its overwhelming economic and military power, institutionalized through things like Bretton Woods, the UN Security Council, NATO, simply create a new kind of American-led global order, maybe substituting one form of dominance for another?
It's that fundamental question about the nature of American power and influence. How do you reconcile the ideals of the UN Charter with the realities of atomic bombs and containment policy? A contradiction that really defines the next phase of American history.
Definitely something to chew on. Thanks for joining us for the deep dive.